can see your fingerprints upon my life, always seeking my best. There were times when your way would make no sense, but as you said, you have never left. You are always good. You are only good. You are always good to me. Though my eyes can't see, help my heart believe. You are always only good. Looking in, I can see my frailty, my sin is great, and my strength is so small. Still you stay, and your mercy shelters me. You hold my hand, and you hear my call. Looking up, I can see your sympathy, my doubt, myself, but I'm sure of your love. Lavish grace was poured out at Calvary, securing me for home above. You are always good. You are only good. You are always good to me. Though my eyes can't see, help my heart believe. You are always only good. You are always good. You are only good. You are always good to me. Though my eyes can't see, help my heart believe. You are always only good.
All right, go ahead and turn to 2 Samuel chapter number 11. 2 Samuel chapter number 11. Hope you had a good day today. Got your ho-ho and done before you get snowed in. Anybody see the basketball scores today? Okay, we won't talk about that anyway. I did. I was very excited about those. Anyway, 2 Samuel chapter number 11. We kind of hold a bitter grudge against you guys at Indiana Hoosiers. I think the last time we played, I don't remember who won. I think it was you guys in the Sweet 16. But anyway, so we always enjoy seeing Kentucky lose. So, but if you're down and out, this is the place to get up and at them. And who knows, this stuff really doesn't matter that much anyway. You guys can just remind us to wait until March and April. And anyway, but we better get going before we get in trouble here. It's interesting when you think about where phrases orient. Have you ever heard someone use the phrase, do you have a skeleton in your closet? Now, I suppose that's probably an older phrase, not used a whole lot by the younger group, although I have heard it many times in my life. That actually originates back in the 1800s over in England, when doctors used to, when they wanted to start experimenting on actual bodies, it was illegal. And so they often had to get a skeleton or a corpse, and then they'd have to hide it. And I guess the typical hiding place for a doctor was a closet or a cupboard. And so that's really where they say the phrase originated. However, today we don't, when we say that, you're not talking about a literal body or skeleton. But when we say, do you have a skeleton in your closet? What we're talking about is, do you have something that you want to keep hidden? Something you don't want folks to know about. Tonight I'd like to talk to you about skeletons in the closet of sin. Now, I know as we talk about sin, there are some obvious things we all right off the bat ought to know. Sin is wrong. Sin has consequences. Sin will be judged. And so a lot of really what we're going to talk about tonight are not things that you're not aware of, but in our carnal, sinful mind, a lot of times what we like to do with some of the ideas about sin, we like to keep them hidden. We like to stuff them away in the closets and in the cupboards of our lives and not allow them to be a part of our thoughts or dwelling on our mind. Tonight we're looking at David. And it's amazing to look at sin. We were looking at a godly man who was called a man after God's own heart. And yet even David, a man considered to be a man after God's own heart, was not immune to the powerful desires of his own wicked heart. And we're going to look at a tragic story in the life of David contained here in 2 Samuel chapter 11 when David allows himself to fall into the snare of adultery with Bathsheba. And through David's sin, we're going to learn some life lessons about sin that, again, I'm sure you're aware of, but yet again, I think the devil and I think our own nature likes to keep these things hidden away so we will not think about them. Number one, as we look at skeletons in the closet of sin here in 2 Samuel chapter 11, I want you to see that sin beckons all. Sin beckons all. 2 Samuel chapter 11 and verse 1. And it came to pass after the time of year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David tarried still at Jerusalem. Now, for time's sake, we can't really dive into this verse but this is a very debated verse. Should David have gone to battle or should he not have? I believe the Bible implies, I think he should have been going to battle. It was a time when kings go. Later you're going to see he goes off to battle, and he is quite successful. And yet there are others who say he shouldn't have, he was old. And we can set that debate aside to say this in the least, that David had become content and complacent in his life. You say, Brother Combs, isn't that a good thing to be content? It's great to be content in every area of our life save one. We ought never be content with our relationship with God. This is why the Apostle Paul said in the New Testament, I have not yet attained. Anytime we get to the point to where we say, hey, everything between man and God, we're right where we ought to be. And I am just satisfied as how close I can be with God. You're in big trouble. Because our heart's desire ought to be continually, I want to be closer to Him. I want to draw nigh closer to Him. And I'll find this to be true in my life so often. The closer I get to God, the more I realize how really far I am away. And David had become content, but then he became complacent. Part of his complacency, can we say it in another word? He got lazy. He got used to having a good life. David, when he thought about going out and having beans or whatever the army cook probably would have ordered up for him, hey, how can you beat having servants at home who are giving you the fatted calf and all the luxuries? And, you think about sleeping out in the tents. Boy, who wants to sleep out on a tent when you can sleep in a nice room and have servants waiting on you and sleep on a nice padded bed? And again, David was getting older, and David probably in some aspects did deserve a little bit of ease. But you know what? This complacency, as we're going to see tonight, comes back really to haunt him, and he's going to give in to a beckoning call or a desire in his life called sin. Sin beckons all of us. As we travel around the country in evangelism, we get the opportunity to see some very beautiful places. But along the way, we have our hardships and trials. One of these hardships comes in the form of a small, four-legged, furry little rodent called a mouse. Now, thankfully, most of the time in revivals, this isn't the case, but when you get into the camping realm, that's when you get those fun things. And I remember my wife and I, our first year traveling together in evangelism, we went out to camp in Kansas, drove 10 hours, got there, ate supper, preached, we were wiped out, we went right to bed, didn't think anything about it. The next day, however, was a different story. Now, when we got to camp, I go up to registration. That's a great place to go because not only do you meet the campers as they come in, you get to hear everything about the camp, the goods, the bads, the uglies, because teens, they'll just be brutal and tell you what's true. And they had been talking about there were a bunch of mice. Well, I didn't want my wife to know about that, so I kind of left that just between, her and the Lord, us and the Lord. Anyway, that second night, though, we got our win. We slept in a little bit. It was a junior camp, so I love junior camps. They have a nap period. And I believe you ought to follow those schedules at camp. And so we'd taken our hour nap. Well, that night, we weren't as tired, and all of a sudden we heard it. My wife said, what was that? I said, the air conditioning probably kicked on, something like that. I don't think that's the air conditioning. I said, it's a new place. You're always going to hear bumps. And, well, the more I tried to convince her that it wasn't a mouse, the more that mouse just made noise all over the place. Finally, we turned on the lights. We tore that cabin apart. Couldn't find the mouse. Went back to bed, laid down. There he goes again. Well, to make a long story short, we slept with the lights on that night. Have you ever tried to sleep with the lights on? It's amazing. Tomorrow afternoon, you come home, you got the ball game on or whatever, and the lights are all on, and you fall right asleep. But when it's night and you're laying down, I don't know how you are, but for me, I can't sleep with the lights on. Well, that night, I got very little sleep. Had time to name the mouse. We named him Mickey. And I decided, you know what, Mickey, you better not push it anymore or you're going to get it. Mickey the mouse that day in our room was only doing what his nature had taught him. To scavenge and to search for food. That's the same nature, not the mouse, but we have a nature just like that. It's called a sin nature. Think about your life. Did anybody have to teach you to do what was wrong? Now, there were probably some people, some friends who contributed to your delinquency or whatever, but for the most part, you didn't have to. Now, think about all the good things you do in life. You had to be taught. You're all sitting here nice and still for the most part. Thank you. Your parents worked really hard for you to be able to do that. If you learned to read and to write and to count, it was all taught to you. If you meet someone that says please or thank you, that's not by accident. They have been taught and they have been worked with. Nobody ever had to work with you and say, now let me teach you how to be a liar. You know what? If you want to tell a good humdinger, here you go. Nobody had to do that. Nobody had to sit you down and say, okay, now there's 100 toys in this room. Whoever takes that one toy, you go up and you want that and throw a fit and throw a punch. Nobody has to do that. Because that is exactly the way our sin nature is. David said this in the Psalms. He says, behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Now, David says two very interesting things about our sin nature there. Before we're even born, he uses the word sin, and he uses the word iniquity. Now, sometimes if we're not careful, we lump sin and iniquity together, and we say, well, they're the same thing. Well, if they were the same thing, they'd be the same word. They're very close in meaning, but there's also some differences. If we look at these two words tonight, they're going to help us to understand who we really are deep down inside. Sin, if you look up what it means in the Bible, in the Hebrew it means to miss the mark. When we sin, we are missing the mark of God's standard. We had a men's shoot several weeks ago and had the target set up. And I hadn't shot a gun in probably 2 years. And I went out with my son and we did some target practice. And guess what? Several times I missed the mark. I didn't hit it. I wasn't aiming right. That target is there, and there's that big black circle in the middle for a reason. That's what you're supposed to hit. And for us in our life to measure up to God's standard, we got to hit that mark every single time. And you say, what is that mark called? It's called perfection. It's called righteousness. You say, Brother Combs, there is nobody that can measure up to that. Exactly. That's because of who we are. We are sinners. We have broken the laws of God. Paul said it this way in Romans 3:10, as it is written, there is none righteous. No, not one. Now, typically what we like to do is we like to give maybe that point over to God and say, okay, well, nobody's perfect, Brother Combs. We all do things that are wrong. But I'm really not that bad. And it's our sinful nature that makes us want to go and find someone else that's worse off than we are and say, at least I'm not like that person. And then we therefore elevate ourselves and somehow put ourselves in an acceptable category. Can I tell you, there's really only one of two categories. It is righteousness or unrighteousness. You're either in the perfection without sin or you are with sin. Take, for instance, if you say, okay, Brother Combs, what if you only sin 10 times a day? Really, if you only sin 10 times a day, you'd be doing pretty good. We think of sin, and again, our mind, carnality takes it. Well, I didn't rob a bank today, didn't shoot anybody. Well, were you lazy? You knew there was something needed to be done, and you didn't do it. Did you have a wicked thought? Did you say something that was unkind, or maybe said something that was true, but in a harsh way to hurt somebody? Boy, you get into all of the different sins of omission, sins of commission, If you just sinned 10 a day, you'd be doing really well. But do you realize by the end of the year, you would have sinned over 3,650 times? By the time you are pushing 28 years of age, you'd be over the 10,000 barrier. For those of you that are over 40, when you hit that 40 mark, just 10 times a day, you'd be over almost 15,000 sins. And if you live to be 80, just sinning 10 times a day, by the time you're 80, over 30,000 sins. You know, it's amazing. We think, well, it's not that big a deal. But we don't stop to keep an accurate tally as to how wicked we truly are. My mom used to say this. She used to say, sin is like bananas. They always come in a bunch. You ever see a banana all by itself? Naturally, they're all together. I'll never forget the first time we went shopping, Pastor, with my wife. First time we ever met, we got married, went shopping. I never paid attention to what Mom did. And my wife went up and took 2 bananas off the thing. And what were you doing? I didn't know you could do that. Oh, you had to just take the whole bunch of them. I didn't know you could level them out like that. But you know what? You're used to seeing bananas all together. You know, when we sin, and this is again getting into the idea of why we sin more than 10, usually when we sin, we don't just sin once. We sin in bananas. We sin in multiples. Just look at David. What sin did David break here in 2 Samuel chapter number 11? Don't be shy. The sin, commandment. Which commandment did he break? The sin of adultery. Correct. He broke the commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. But you know, if you scrape through and you look really at what David did, he broke more than just one. Start off, it says that David, he coveted. He coveted. He looked at Bathsheba, he wanted her, and so he broke the commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Of course, this led to him breaking the one we all just mentioned, thou shalt not commit adultery. In doing this, he brought great dishonor to his family and to her, so he broke the commandment, honor thy father and thy mother. In doing this, he did not uphold the godly standard that he professed and that he wrote about in the Psalms, so therefore he broke the commandment that thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Of course, we know when he took Bathsheba, he stole her from Uriah the Hittite. So he broke the command, thou shalt not steal. In order to cover up this command, he lied. Thou shalt not bear false witness. We find towards the end of this that he's going to have to kill Uriah. So he's going to break the command, thou shalt not kill. Throughout this process, David elevated himself really above God and treated himself as if he was above God's standards, and therefore he broke the command, thou shalt have no other gods before me. We have gone just a quick synopsis over the 10 commandments, and just in one instance, one chapter in David's life, he's broken at least 8 of the 10 commandments. You see how sin has an ability to take hold of our life and cause us not to just miss the mark, but to miss it badly. In fact, to miss the entire paper altogether. David said, behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. That word iniquity has the idea of to bend or to pervert. Sin means we miss the mark. It's talking about our activity. What we're doing causes us to miss it. Iniquity has the idea of more behind the reasoning. Why are we missing? Because we're bent. You know what? When something is bent, it can never be straightened perfectly back to where it was before with the same strength. You take a piece of metal, and pastor could do this and just break that and bend it in half. Well, you know, eventually if we get a couple guys and some tools, you could bend that thing back. But anybody that's an expert on metal will tell you that metal's never going to be the same again. There's always going to be now a weak point. Have you ever sprained an ankle or a ligament or something, and the doctor tells you, you know, it'd have been better if you just broke that ankle? I've had a doctor tell me that. Because, you know, when you bend it and then it comes back, you always have a weak point there. And they tell you, I don't know why, but if you break it, you're probably better off because then they confuse it or whatever, and it grows back together. Something that is bent is never going to be back. You know, even Ecclesiastes 1:15 says this, that which is crooked cannot be made straight. So David says, listen, here's the reason why I'm a sinner. From the womb, when I was living in my mother's womb, I was born, I was shapen in iniquity. I came out of that womb bent against the things of God. And in sin was I conceived, that when I came out, because my nature was bent against God, I just sinned. I missed the mark, and I fell utterly short. You know, sin beckons all. As we look at sin beckoning all, we've seen the rhyme of sin, then we see the time of sin. You know, sin beckons all of us regardless of our age, our affluence, or even our achievements. David is about 50 here in 2 Samuel chapter 11. Really, you would think he'd be at the ideal time of life. You know, when you're young, you're kind of foolish. And sometimes we can even tell people, well, they just don't know any better. They need to grow up. Well, I think we would all classify David as a grown-up man. He's 50 years of age. But you know what? Even as a 50-year-old man, he was susceptible to the sins of a 20-year-old. I'll never forget my dad, when we were teenagers, they did this split class for the teenagers. And my mom took the girls and my dad took the guys. And I'll never forget, my dad was talking. He was up in his 40s. I mean, he was old back in those days. You know, when you're a kid, isn't it funny how that age is? And that person's 40, they're ancient. And then you get to be about 30, it's like, okay, that bar's going up some. Well, he was 40, and I'll never forget, he said, guys, I want to tell you this. He said, you know what, you think, well, I'm going to get married, I'm going to grow up, and then, you know what, you're not going to have to deal with those temptations that men struggle with. He said, I'll tell you, that temptation never goes away. And I'll never forget sitting there. I was pretty much floored by that. I thought, are you kidding me? My dad, the old 40-year-old, he still has the same struggles that I'm having here at 13 years of age. I got to tell you, here I am. I'm pushing up to that 40 mark. And I tell you, it's true. I still have that sin nature, and it doesn't go away. And I'm married, and I have kids, and I ought to be hopefully a little bit more mature than what I was back in those days. But I tell you, sin affects us regardless of our age, regardless of our affluence. You know, David had lots of money. He had whatever he wanted. Sometimes we think, well, people sin because they just don't have, and so they want to steal, and they covet because if they just had more. And kind of the sin of lust is that I can satisfy it. You know, one look at that computer screen, I just have, and if I look, I'll be okay, I'll be satisfied. Wrong. It's a lie from the devil. You look and you say, I think I want more. Yeah. Sin affects us regardless of age, affluence, but also regardless of our achievements. David was a success. And not just a successful king, he was a successful Christian. But you know, sometimes when we're successful as believers, we set ourselves up for pretty big falls. Because what happens is we grow like David, content and complacent. And before we know it, we are ravaged by sin. 1 Kings 15 and verse 5 says this about David. Because David did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, and turned not aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life. Well, that'd be a great verse. But it doesn't end there. God finishes off the verse and says this, save only in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. David is successful spiritually. He's achieving things that many of us say it would be wonderful for us spiritually. But you know what? Because he was there, he got complacent, he got content. Because of this, he made a great blunder. I've heard many preachers say, if you think you can handle sin, you're stronger than the strongest man who ever lived, wiser than the wisest man that ever lived, and you have a heart closer than a man who had a heart like unto the Lord's. You think about it, who's the strongest man who ever lived? Samson. How does his life end? Destroyed by sin. Who's the wisest man who ever? Ironically, it's David's own son, Solomon, and yet the wisest man who ever lived died a fool, pursuing all kinds of different things and really turning his back for the most part upon God. And then here we have David, a man after God's own heart, who he too gets on the hit list of sin. Can I tell you, if these three men can fall, how much more can you and I be susceptible to the sins of this world? You know, as we look at sin beckons all, we see the rhyme of sin, the time of sin, then we see the crime of sin. Boy, sin is really good at selling you a pack of lies. Number one, the crime of sin is that pleasure is always promoted. Oh, you turn on the TV, what are some of the most entertaining, amusing commercials? They're the alcohol commercials. And there's everybody having a great time and ha-ha and hee-hee and all that. And they don't promote everything about the alcohol. They can't. They just want to promote this is cool, this will make your life wonderful, and really, in essence, they lie to you. They don't show you people who can't hold down jobs, people who wreck their car and kill people, families that are divided and ruined. They can't. You look at the typical primetime television. What do they show you? Everybody going out, fooling around, being immoral, and it's wonderful, and it's a great thing. And again, they don't show you all of the diseases, the families that are broken up, the people who are killed or hurt because of these crimes. The crime of sin is pleasure is promoted, but then also private sin always becomes public. You know, when David committed this sin with Bathsheba, he had the perfect sin, at least in his mind. Dark at night, late, will sneak her over in the back door, out the back door before anybody will know it, and nobody will know. But it's interesting, much like her pregnancy that will come of this, that's how sin is. You know, when you're first expecting, nobody knows. In fact, odds are, initially, you're not even quite aware of it. But I got to tell you, the longer that pregnancy goes, the more people find out. It's just a natural thing. Well, you know, it's the same thing that's true with our sin. You say, well, I'm just in my room and it's dark and it's only me. Well, private sin always has a way of becoming public sin. J. Vernon McGee says this: secret sin on earth is open scandal in heaven. And David's going to find that out real fast. Number one, we've seen tonight, sin beckons all. Now we see number two, sin begins small. Sin begins small. Yeah, hey, they're talking about snow next week. Maybe. You ever built yourself a snowman? I hadn't done it for a long time. A couple of years ago, we got enough snow and thought, let's go out and build that snowman. We got 45 minutes. Forgot how long that took. But you take that ball, right? And you get it all cupped up, and then what do? You roll. And you roll, and you roll, and you roll, and you roll forever. But the more you roll it in the snow, the bigger that ball gets. Well, that's the way sin works in so many lives. Let us read on here and find out what happens to David. Verse number 2, it came to pass in an eventime that David arose off his bed, and he walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. Pleasures promoted. Verse 3, and David sent and inquired after the woman. We see what started out was he looked, then he lusted. You know, it's a shame that if David, as far as we know, he was not in the wrong. He was up on his roof. It was hot. Couldn't sleep. He goes out for a walk, and all of a sudden, there she is. He can see everyone's backyards, and she's taking a bath outside. And if David had walked up there and said, oh, man, and he had and turned his head and got down off that roof, we wouldn't be reading. But what happened with David was he took a second look. And a look turned to a lust. Then he lured. He sent and he inquired after the woman. And one said, is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Elam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? It's very interesting that a servant had enough fear of God to say, David, this is not right. This is another man's wife. But you know what? God may have been using that servant to try to warn David, but you know what? David wouldn't listen. David sent and David sent messengers, and he took her. Verse 4. And she came in unto him, and he lay with her. So we see it started with a look. It went to a lusting. It went to a luring. Then we find that he lay with her. Well, then after that, we find, verse 5, the woman conceived. And she told David and said, I'm with child. Again, boy, David, stop right there. I'm wrong. Bring Uriah home. I'm going to apologize. Bring this thing out into the open. But David's not going to do it. Now, there's a few reasons why. I think he likes where he's at. But number two, he can be put to death for this. There's a Jewish law that forbid this. And he and Bathsheba can be put to death. And so instead of solving the matter here, David takes things into his own hands and digs a deeper hole. He lies. David sent to Joab and said, send me Uriah the Hittite. Joab sent Uriah to David. And David, verse 7, and when Uriah was come, David demanded of him how Joab did, how the people did, and how the war prospered. Well, David is turning into a car salesman here. He is just putting on the dog. Hey, how's Joab? How's the battle? That's not the reason he brought Uriah home. David, verse 8, says, go, wash thy feet. And Uriah departed out of the king's house, and there followed him a mess of meat from the king. He said, hey, go home. We're sending you the catered meal. Go home and have yourself a good time, and have a good night there at your home. Well, what David wants is to cover up his sin. If Uriah goes home, there's an explanation now for this sudden pregnancy. But you know what? Uriah had more character than David gave him credit for. Because Uriah, verse 9, slept at the door of the king's house. In verse 10, when they had told David, Uriah went not down, David came and said, in essence, why didn't you go home? In verse 11, for time's sake, he said, I can't go home and enjoy my home and enjoy my wife. Our men are out there sleeping on the fields. They're out there not enjoying the comforts. And you know what? I may be home, but I'm going to live like the rest out there. Verse 12, David said to Uriah, tarry here. And then we find verse 13, David conjures up another plan. David called him, he did eat and drink before him, and he made him drunk. Wow, something that started with a look, turned to lust, turned to luring, turned to laying, turned to lying. Now we're seeing that it's going to end. It's going to go with the liquor, and he's going to cause Uriah to get drunk. Here's an amazing thing: Uriah drunk still had more character than David sober at this point. Because what he's hoping is he's drunk, he won't have his senses, he's going to go home now. But Uriah still does not go home. And again, what started with looking, lusting, luring, laying, lying, liquoring up, now turned to loathing. David goes to his final plan, and this plan is, let's kill him. I remember in teen camp, I heard a preacher once say, indulgent people ultimately become indifferent people. And you know, that is so true. Someone who indulges their life with sin ultimately becomes indifferent, and the people they become indifferent to are the very people who love them the very most. Do you know who Uriah is? He's one of David's mighty men. When everybody else forsook David and David fled for his life, Uriah left everything and said, David, I will follow and I will serve you. Now, David, with the callousness of a ruthless murderer, is going to say, I'm writing a note. Will you send this back to Joab? He writes Uriah's death sentence and says, Uriah, carry this back and give this dispatch to Joab. David had such confidence in the character of Uriah, he was able to carry his own death sentence because David knew he wouldn't read it. Uriah goes back and in essence comes to Joab. Joab reads David's letter and David says, hey, put him up at the heat of the battle. If you have to, pull the men back, but make sure he's dead. And Joab, this is kind of his game. He knows all this. And plus, he realizes it's going to be a political favor down the road for me. He follows through with it. And we find tragically Uriah the Hittite is killed. We find as Joab sends a messenger back to David, verse 19. And he says, when you've made an end of telling him, if his wrath arise, verse 20, and ask, why did you approach the city so near? Then you're to tell him, Uriah the Hittite is dead also, verse 21. Joab says, don't worry, if David gets mad, that's all you got to tell him. That'll calm him down. So the messenger went and came and showed David, verse 22, all that Joab had sent him. And the messenger said unto David, and he tells him that Uriah was killed. And then verse 25, notice how callous David is. He says, let not this thing displease thee. The sword devours one as well as another. Make thy battle more strong against the city, and overthrow it, and encourage thou him. We find verse 27, when the morning was past, David sent and fetched her to his house. She became his wife and bare him a son, but the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. How callous. A man who was so loyal to David, and all David does is just say, oh, well, yeah, people are killed in battle all the time. No, David, in God's eyes, you're the one that pulled that arrow back and shot it right through his heart, because you surely sent him to his death. And yet, as we finish up this chapter, we find a great display of the mercies of God. You know, you would think that you would find God striking David dead in an instance. And yet, let us not forget that this thing, surely God makes the statement that God was displeased. And yet, I love what Matthew Henry says. He said, one would think it should have followed that the Lord sent enemies to invade him, terrors to take hold on, and the messengers of death to arrest him. No, instead, he sent a prophet. God, in his love and his mercy, sent his word to say, David, you are wrong. And by the way, you will be judged. You know, sometimes we look at the firm hand of God that corrects us and even judges us, and we say, God, that's not fair. God, you are so unloving. Boy, look at how merciful and loving he really is to David here, in not giving David really the full wrath that he so deserved. You know, sin beckons all. Sin begins small. That old Mickey the Mouse, that next night I thought, well, maybe he'll knock it off. I was washing up after a game, and my wife was standing in the doorway there talking to me. And here he came. He's getting bold now. And he actually stood right between her 2 feet. At that moment, I was faced with the dilemma. How do I tell her that that mouse is right there between her 2 feet? And I don't know. She must have read my mind because she said, he's here. I said, yes. He's right between my feet, isn't he? I said, yes, he is. He ran one way, she ran the other. Boy, we tear that place up, and we said, that's it. The war is on. Sorry, Mickey. You're no longer going to be a mouse when we get through with you. I went down to the kitchen, got myself a trap, got me some peanut butter. That's the way to get them mice. They have a tough time chewing it up like we do, and I put that trap out, baited it with peanut butter, stuck it right there in the floor, and we had our bed. We had like a front row seat, and I thought, I'm going to leave this light on. I want to see Mickey. Man, I want to see him die. Ruthless. And then he crossed the line. You know, we waited, and we waited. Old Mickey wouldn't come out. He must have been shy. So I said, I'll get him. I turned the lights off, and we began to wait. You know, here in 2 Samuel chapter 11, we see sin beckons all. Sin begins small, but then this and we're done. Sin's bill is tall. Adrian Rogers used to say, sin fascinates, then it assassinates. Chapter 12, again, for time's sake, we're not going to really delve into this, but the prophet Nathan comes, tells a story to David. Says, David, there was this guy, and he had a little lamb. He loved the lamb. He cherished the lamb. It was a little pet, almost like part of the family. There was this guy that lived next to him, had a huge house, all the sheep he could possibly have. Well, you know how God knows how to get your heart's cord. David's a shepherd. He knew what it was like to be attached to sheep. And the prophet says, and this rich guy, he had some friends come over, and he said, we're not going to kill any of ours. And they stole that lamb and killed that lamb, that pet. And you know, David got angry. Verse 5, David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. And he said, as the Lord liveth, that man hath done this thing shall surely die, and he shall restore the lamb fourfold. And then Nathan changed everything with 4 words. Thou art the man. By the way, that baby was born in the process. David more than likely lived in this sin for almost a year. Sometimes we feel like we're getting away with sin, but we're not. David, to his credit, confesses his sin. You read in some of these Psalms, as we read about, behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Part of that is David bearing his soul to God, and he calls it. He said, I have sinned, and I've sinned against thee and thee alone. See, David was a man after God's own heart. Didn't mean he was perfect like God. It meant when he was living and following God, he often saw things the way God saw. And boy, in his confession, do you see that? But you know what? Confession does not end the consequences. I know with our children, sometimes they can get into the habit of, as soon as they do wrong, oh, Daddy, I'm sorry. Now, sometimes they're sincere, and that is it is so wonderful. But sometimes, and you kind of can discern this a little as a parent, you know that there's not as much sincerity as in they just want to pacify so they don't get something else that starts with a P, okay? And they don't want to get a paddling. And so they're saying, Dad, or they don't want to be grounded, so they're saying, I'm sorry, because they just want everything to be better without really dealing with the problem. You know, sometimes if we're not careful as Christians, we do that with God. Oh, I'm sorry. And maybe we're a little ashamed of what we did, and we don't want, but the big reason behind the motive is, and I have hurt God, I have wronged him. Our motive is, I don't want to be judged. Can I tell you, the Bible does promise if we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. God will forgive, but that doesn't mean that all the consequences will be wiped away. What kind of a bill did David have to pay? Let me quickly rattle off the ones at least that I can pull out from the passage. This baby that he and Bathsheba has will die. His daughter Tamar will be raped. His son Amnon will be killed. That's 2 sons, by the way, that have died at this point. Absalom, his beloved son, will rebel against him. David will have to flee Jerusalem. Ahithophel, it's a hard name to say, his trusted counselor, will betray David. By the way, Ahithophel was Bathsheba's grandfather. You think he remembered what David had done? He rebels against him. We find that Absalom lays with David's wives out in public, as Nathan had told him would happen. Absalom, his son, is killed. That's 3 sons that are gone. Sheba rebels. Amasa is murdered by Joab. The Philistines war with Israel. Adonijah, another son, rebels. He is killed. There's 4. Joab rebels. He is killed. Abiathar, the priest, rebels. Solomon will go on to live foolishly and marry multiple wives, and maybe the list could go on and on. Do you remember David in his rage when he said, he will restore 4-fold? Because of this sin, David's going to pay 4-fold. And he's going to lose the lives of 4 sons. Do you think if David was standing out on that balcony that night and it saw the bill that he'd have to pay, don't you think he would have been more likely to say, no way, I don't even want to be near this? But you know, every time we sin, there's a bill that has to be paid. There are consequences that will be coming. And by the way, the more we cover it up, the greater these consequences are. Boy, when we come to sin, we've got to remember that sin's bill is tall. Oh, Mickey the Mouse got that light off. We waited, and finally I heard it. Snapped him, but he only got pinned in the shoulder. So old Mickey was dragging that trap around, and you know what I did? I went and found a broom, turned the handle over, and splattered him all over the place. Killed him. I wasn't going to let him live. Can I tell you, that's exactly what Satan wants to do to your life. He just doesn't want to wound you. He just doesn't want to get you pinned down. I'm serious. He wants to absolutely devour and destroy your life. Before we finish tonight, I do want to give you one more thought, and this is from J. Vernon McGee, and our time will be done. We think about skeletons in the closet of sin. Sin beckons all. Sin begins small. And sin's bill is tall. But I'm so thankful no matter how much we've sinned that, you know what, God will forgive. And J. Vernon McGee says this about David. He says, the sin of David stands out like a tar baby in a field of white snow. It's like a blackberry in a bowl of cream. It may cause us to miss the greatness of David. Remember that sin was the exception in David's life and not the pattern of it. You know, as we think about sin, maybe you're here today and God needed to remind you about these truths about sin. Again, I don't think anybody here tonight saying, oh, man, I never knew that. I think we all know these. But I think, isn't it amazing when we begin to dabble and to dwell in sin, how quickly we push these so far from memory and we don't think about them until it's too late. May God help us to be victorious in this battle against sin. Let's quietly stand, please, with our heads bowed and our eyes closed. Heads are bowed, eyes are closed. Not a pleasant passage to look at tonight. I don't enjoy it. I don't enjoy it because reading about David, there's a great fondness and a love for him, but I also don't like it because, boy, it hits so close to my home. How many times I have failed. How many times I have suffered the consequences and have been victimized by sin. If you're here tonight, the ultimate victim of sin is someone that dies and goes to hell. Because Jesus died. Paid the price for your sin. Died to save your soul. If you realize that you're a sinner, bent against the things of God, shapen in iniquity, conceived in sin, and you realize there's nothing you can do except come to the cross of Jesus Christ and by faith trust Him and Him alone to save you. If you do that today, the Lord will save you. I can tell you, after you're saved, that doesn't mean you stop sinning. Till the day we die, we still got that sin nature and we still have that iniquity, that bend against God. We don't lose our salvation after that. David wasn't expelled from God's family. But look at the hardships and the trials. And really look at the opportunities maybe that David left undone because of this one episode of sin. If you're here today and there's a sin in your life, confess and forsake it. God promises to have mercy. Maybe you're here tonight and you say, it's too far. I'm too deep in it. You're never too deep. You're never too far. Maybe you may need to talk to someone. Pastors here. You don't necessarily have to go into any details unless you so desire, but maybe you just need some accountability and some help and some counsel. Whatever you need to do, let's do business tonight. Father, thank you for this day, and yes, thank you for this hard passage in the Bible. It's not pleasant, it's not pretty at all, but yet it's very practical for each and every one of us. Help me in my life, and the sin that I have, that I deal with. Father, help these dear folks. I know we may look and say, well, I've never done adultery, I've never murdered, but Father, sin is sin in your eyes. And no matter whether it's a lie or whether it is the act of killing someone, all is against you and displeases you greatly. I pray, Father, that you'd help us to have victory. I pray if there's one here today that's never seen the ultimate victory of sin, they do so. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Heads are bowed, eyes are closed. I'm going to ask the organist to begin to play. If God spoke,